Hello and welcome back to Bedtime Stories from First UCC. We are on Chapter 6, The King's Forgiveness, from The King's Messenger by Carolyn Clare Givens. Smuggins was in disgrace. Most of the other messengers wouldn't even speak to him. He stood at the edge of the king's courtroom, looking at the empty throne on the dais. On the floor in front of it was a small chair, and the royal prince sat in it, dealing with the affairs of the kingdom until the king's return. The empty throne made the whole castle feel strange, as if it were a living being that was going about its activities without its heart. Only when the king returned to sit in his throne would the heart begin to beat again. As much as Smuggins wanted to see the king sitting on his throne again, he dreaded the day of his return from the north. Because Smuggins thought, then he'll know I failed him. Smuggins had been given a task by the king. They set out the same day, the king leading an army toward the north to engage his enemy. Smuggins, dressed in peasant clothes, went south to serve the governor there. It was supposed to be a simple task, though vital to the war against the king's enemy. Smuggins was to infiltrate a group of the enemy's followers, then report on their activities to the king's governor. At first, everything seemed to be working. Smuggins had arrived in the south in good time and gotten a job working in the gold mines. He made a few friends and let it be known that he sympathized with the king's enemy. Very soon, one of the enemy's followers sought him out and asked him to come to a meeting. Smuggins thought that he made a good impression, but the enemy's followers must have been suspicious because one of them was tasked to follow him. Without realizing it, Smuggins gave himself away by going to the governor's mansion to make his report. At the next meeting, the enemy's followers turned to him and beat him badly. He fought hard and just barely made his escape. He spent nearly a month in the governor's mansion recovering before he was able to make the journey back to the capital city. The messengers discussed his mission in depth the night he arrived. And Nagins picked apart every action Smuggins had taken, and then pointed out how he would have done it better. "It was the trip to the governor's mansion that did you in, Smuggins," he said. "Absolutely. You should have been watching your back," Muggins agreed. "You can never be too careful, Smuggins," Figgins pointed out. I put it down to inexperience," Staggins said. "Yes, but even I would know to keep a wary eye out," Sasha said disdainfully. "Stop it, all of you," Misha broke out. "Misha, don't," Smuggins pleaded. Tears stung his eyes in response to the words the others had said. He just wanted to leave. "No, Smuggins, they have no right to speak to you like that," Misha said with as much firmness as she could. You all are picking apart everything he did, but you weren't there, and you don't know what you would have done if it had been you. If Smuggins did wrong, that's for the king to decide, not you or me. And if when the king returns, he finds that Smuggins was at fault, then he will deal with Smuggins himself." There was silence all around the messenger's table, and one by one they got up to leave until just Smuggins and Misha were left. "Thank you," Smuggins said. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Misha replied. You needed to hear it as much as the rest of them." "But Misha, what they said was true," Smuggins said. "I wasn't careful enough, and I should have been warier. I let my inexperience get in the way." "Even so, that's for the king to decide, and he'll do that when he returns." "I'm dreading that day. With the roads the way they are in the north, I doubt he'll get any message before he returns, and he'll come into his courtroom and read the report, and he'll call me forward to explain myself." Smuggins could picture it all. "Smuggins," Misha sighed, "you know the king. You know that he is compassionate and forgiving. He'll forgive you. But he'll be disappointed in me." It was that disappointment that Smuggins dreaded most about the king's return. He knew Misha was right, and that the king would forgive him. But he didn't want to have to see the disappointment in the king's eyes when he heard how Smuggins had failed. As Smuggins looked at the empty throne, he wondered how long it would be until he had to look into those eyes. A few days later, the king entered the city, his army battered but victorious. Another blow had been struck at the enemy's forces. The people of the city thronged to the streets to watch the army return. They knew the war was not over, but they could not help cheering and celebrating. The king smiled as the people as he rode through the streets, weary, but seeing that they needed something to celebrate. Smuggins stood at the side of the king's courtroom with the other messengers. When the king entered, the royal prince stood from his seat and knelt on the floor. "My brother, I have kept your kingdom for you. I return it to you now," he said. "My thanks to your stewardship." The king took the royal prince by the arm as he rose. "I know it has been in good hands." "We have here reports of all that has happened," the royal prince said, and Oniggins stepped forward with a sheaf of papers. The king took the papers from him. "Thank you, Oniggins." "Yes, your majesty," Oniggins said, as he stepped back into the line of messengers. The king looked down the line of messengers and smiled. "I have missed you all so much," he said. "I look forward to hearing what has happened while I was away." "Smuggins?" The dreaded moment had come. "At your service, your majesty." Smuggins stepped forward. "I am glad you are returned safely. I trust your mission was a success." Smuggins found it hard to say the words he had to. "No, your majesty." "No?" The king's shoulders seemed to droop. I failed, your majesty." Smuggins was trying to keep the emotion out of his voice. "I am grieved to hear it," the king said. "We will talk further when I have read the report. You may step back." "Yes, your majesty." Smuggins wondered if this crushing grief he felt would overwhelm him before they spoke again. The king glanced down at the sheaf of reports in his arms and turned to address the whole courtroom. "I have much reading to do, and I am in great need of rest." He walked to the far side of the courtroom and went through the door to his private apartments, the only place where he never had guests. It was the next day that the king addressed Smuggins again. "Smuggins, step forth," he said, sitting in his throne, the living heart of the kingdom beating once again. "At your service, your majesty," Smuggins said, stepping out. "I have read the report of your mission," the king announced, "and I find that you did, indeed, fail in the task I set for you." "Yes, your majesty." Smuggins felt tears in his eyes. "Smuggins' failure does not make you any less my messenger. Will you still serve me to the best of your ability?" I will, your majesty." "That is all I ask. Do not continue to berate yourself for what might have been. I forgive you. No one can reproach you for what happened ever again." The tears would not be held back any longer. "I am sorry, your majesty." "I know, Smuggins," the king said kindly. "Now stand ready as a messenger." "Yes, your majesty," Smuggins said, stepping back. The king turned to the room at large and addressed all the courtiers. I have yet to make my report," he said. "The war continues against my enemy, who has set himself against me for the rule of my kingdom. I led our army north when I heard that the enemy's forces were regrouping and poised to strike at our northern cities. I wanted to face him myself and fight against him with my own strength. We met in the foothills of the great northern mountains, and..." The king's voice broke, and he paused to regain his composure. "The blood of both sides now waters that ground. The battle was long and fierce. For weeks we met day after day, burying our dead in the dark of the night. But finally, I faced my enemy." The king paused and looked around the courtyard. Everyone was silent, eagerly awaiting the rest of his story. Smuggins glanced down the line of messengers and saw Misha, leaning forward on her toes, her eyes wide, waiting for the king to continue. "We fought in hand-to-hand battle for what seemed like hours, but finally I bested him, and he lay on the ground with the tip of my sword at his throat. 'Finish it,' he snarled at me. I looked down at my oldest friend and I said, 'You have my forgiveness. I ask for your loyalty.' Then I stepped back and walked away. The room was still, filled with crashing silence. The king looked around him at all the faces. Most were gaping, some mouths opening and shutting without making a sound. On others, brows began to furrow and lips hardened into tight lines. Smuggins felt his eyebrows rise and his eyes open wide. He swiped away his drying tears with his hands, as if the motion might wipe away what the king had just said. The king saw this and called him forward. At your service, your majesty. Smuggins struggled to find his voice. Smuggins, what do you think of what I have done? I am shocked, your majesty, Smuggins answered. Tell me, do you think my enemy deserves my forgiveness? The king asked. No, your majesty, Smuggins said. I do not. Did you, Smuggins? Smuggins opened his mouth, but shut it again before words came out. He wanted to say no. He knew that he had failed the king, and that it was only because of the king's goodness that he still served as a messenger. But I always thought what I did wasn't so bad after all, he thought. I always figured he'd forgive me. Our little failures are no less failures than the great ones of the enemy, Smuggins, the king said. And forgiveness is the only true gift. There is no way that it can be earned. Smuggins looked up at the king, the tears flowing down his face again. I wanted to think I did deserve it, he said. Dear Smuggins, the king said, we none of us deserve forgiveness. I hope you enjoyed that chapter about how forgiveness is a gift, how whether we make small mistakes or big mistakes, that forgiveness is a gift given to us, and that we are forgiven by God, like Smuggins was forgiven by the king. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. Tune in tomorrow for chapter 7, The King's Justice.